Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone coming out tonight for what I think is the most important issue and purpose facing America and in many ways the world today, because every other purpose that we stand for depends on our ability to bring the right and the left, the Sunni and the Shia, the contending parties together. And I think, and our experience is that we have the capacity to do that, that the differences that we see between these seemingly irreconcilable opposites actually reflect the strengths that happen when you bring them together. And this is the experience that we've had at Future 500. Future 500 is a little bit of an unusual organization. We are a nonprofit, and we bring together in alliances people who love to hate and demonize one another. Democrats and Republicans, Rush Limbaugh conservatives, and Elizabeth Warren progressives, and more than anything else, historically, some of the world's largest corporations and brands, and the world's most passionate activists, social activists. We are funded by folks on all sides. We're funded by corporations. We're funded by foundations, by individuals on the right and the left. And so we tend to get shot at by both sides occasionally as well, especially before people understand us and the work that we do. And people ask me sometimes, why do you do this? Why, you're getting shot at, you're getting shunned by both sides occasionally. And I say, I can't help it. It's kind of in me. I'm in San Francisco. I am trans and proud. I am a trans partisan. And it seems to be built into me. As a young person, very young person, I started a couple of little businesses that gave me a sense of power that was extraordinary. I encourage any parent out there to encourage your kids to start little businesses, so that by the time I got into college, I felt pretty comfortable that I was going to be financially secure, that I had that power. And I devoted myself to social causes. And so in college, as a registered Republican, a believer in free enterprise, I joined with Ralph Nader, who was, of course, the leading, and still is, I think, the leading consumer advocate, initially as a volunteer, later as a full-time organizer, to organize consumer activist causes. And our first objective at UC Berkeley was to wrest control of the Nader organization there from the Trotskyists, who had gained power and captured the organization. That was part of their strategy for global dominance at the time, was to enter these reformist organizations. So we wrested control of the Nader organization from the Trotskyists, and then carried forward to advance a piece of legislation, a bottle bill, a recycling law for the state of California. I'll tell you how that turned out in a little bit. But I want to tell you 3 stories that illustrate 6 points about transpartisanism in the next few minutes. Story number 1 is a battle that's going on right now today. We all know the battle over climate protection. The way this battle is cast in the media is as a battle between the evil big oil companies and the virtuous big green organizations. It's oil versus environment, and that's the message that sells. Now, there is some truth to that message. Of course, those interests are somewhat in conflict. But what really drives the dominance of that message is the fact that dollar for dollar, a dollar spent on fundraising and media that demonizes the other side raises 2.5 times as much money and generates 5 times as much media as a dollar spent on collaborative, hope-filled, positive messaging. And that is a market reality that drives the fundraising and that drives the media coverage. You do not get media coverage if you put out a story about how people get along. It just doesn't make the news. You get media coverage when you talk about diametrical opposites. I don't think there's anybody conspiring to produce this outcome. This is simply a part of the ad-paid media system that we have today. It's an aspect of the system. We have to understand it. That's how it works. No, it's not that Fox is evil or that MSNBC is evil. It's just that they want viewers because they want to sell ads, and that's what generates the outcome. So we have to understand that system. A couple of years ago, we got together executives from a major oil company, major global oil company, and separately, we got together leaders from one of the best known anti-corporate environmental lobbies on the planet. Separately, we worked with these two groups. And we said, well, what would you do to really solve the climate problem? And we developed a piece of legislation, a carbon tax shift, that reduced taxes on things we want, like income and profits, and that raised taxes on things we don't want, pollution. Both the oil company and the organization endorsed exactly the same policy. It was a policy to establish a tax that would drive down carbon emissions 3% a year in the US and have border adjustments so that the same thing would happen globally, that would accomplish the objectives of the environmentalists and at the same time accomplish the objectives of conservative activists who were focused on reducing taxes. Here we have a system that because you're taxing something negative that you want to go down, you're reducing the problem at 3% a year, and you're reducing taxes at 3% a year. So we had a solution that was cheap and effective, that both the big oil companies and the environmental groups could support. But did that move through Congress? Not at all. How can you get a bill like that through Congress? So what we ended up with was a proposal, same year as Obamacare, probably why it didn't pass, a cap and trade proposal, good concept, but once it got into Congress, what happened to it? It became a $500 billion a year source of funding because you needed the money to pay off the interest groups to reduce their opposition so that the measure could pass. And so, of course, the right is upset about climate protection legislation because they see it as a big tax on the economy, and the left is upset because they can't understand why the right doesn't do anything about it. Number one transpartisan lesson from this is that in today's gridlocked political system, where the left and the right cannot work together, where the purpose-focused left and right can't work together, the only way to pass major legislation is to meet two criteria. Number one, the legislation has to be extremely expensive, and number two, it has to be almost totally ineffective. It has to be expensive, of course, because you need to compensate all of the interest groups that have veto power over that legislation. And it needs to be almost totally ineffective because you can't change the relative power dynamics of any of those groups. They all need to remain in their place and get more. So you're building, as you go, big government and big corporations and big unions and big professional associations. They all get bigger. And as they get bigger, the power of people gets smaller. And that's why we need to talk about empowerment, not about the evil corporations while we overlook big government, and not about the evil government while we overlook the big corporations. We need to talk about empowering people. The second transpartisan lesson is that transpartisanship is not about moderation. It's not about centrism. It's not about splitting the difference. Centrism and moderation typically is what goes on when you finally work out a deal like Obamacare or cap and trade. You pay off all of the various interest groups so that they will allow the legislation to go through. That's moderation. That's why progressives and conservatives hate moderation. They think, this is not what we want. We don't want this kind of compromise. We want something that recognizes our fundamental principles. We don't want to empower big government on the right, and we don't want to empower big corporations on the left. Those objectives are not irreconcilable. They can be accomplished at the same time, but the story doesn't sell. Second story to tell. 2 years ago, a very small group of people, a few activists from Greenpeace, a few activists from a group called Climate Advisors, and some scientists at a group called TFT, created the conditions that compelled a global company, one of the biggest paper companies on the planet, to stop deforesting Indonesia. This was APP, Asia Pulp and Paper, one of the companies that for generations has been tearing down native forests. And they convinced them to stop. Now, how did they do that? They did that by bringing together companies with the buying power and creating a bit of a threat to those companies. If you're buying from this company, you're deforesting. And our role organizationally was to work with the companies to help them develop procurement standards that would eliminate the purchase of this wood. Within a very short time, by understanding the systems that were at play, we were able to transform one of the biggest paper companies in the world into a sustainable operation. The lesson from that is that you don't need big government or big corporations to accomplish big objectives. In fact, all you need to do is to understand the systems. You need to understand system number one, nature, the planetary ecosystem, and you also have to understand system number two, markets, the human ecosystem. If you understand those two systems, then you can generate change. That's empowerment. Knowledge is that empowerment. And a small number of people from Greenpeace and others can drive positive global change if they understand that. My final story, 35 years ago or so, when I joined with Ralph Nader, we wanted to pass a California bottle bill, a simple law for recycling beverage containers. And he and I toured the state doing press conferences. He would lambast the evil corporations that were blocking our legislation, and I would advance the positive solution. Well, when it came down to actually getting something passed, we worked with a couple of heroes of mine. One, Bill Coors, of Bill and Joe Coors. They were the Koch brothers of that era, supposedly, rigid right-wing ideologues. And we raised a lot of money with the extremism that their allies like James Watt advanced. But Bill Coors turned out to be a very good man. I called him up. He said, "You're the first environmentalist to actually call me and have a conversation." He met with me secretly, developed an approach to the bottle bill that was cheap and effective, that was better than the model. And then the other hero of mine, when I came back to California, was Chuck Collings, a religious right conservative, a social conservative, who headed up the state's third largest retail chain and felt that we had more integrity than the folks on his side, and he wanted to work with us. So this is a guy that you would say, oh, he's never going to be on the environmentalist side. He's on the other side. Two guys. But the power that he had as the number 3 retailer to get together number 1 and 2 and to collectively tell the industry that they had to work with us and work out a deal enabled us to pass California's CRV recycling system, which today is the most cost-effective system of recycling beverage containers in the country. We've got 80% plus recycling rates in the state, and we've saved billions of dollars because we brought the right and the left together to get it done. So the transpartisan lessons from that are they won't care what you know until they know that you care. If you're on the left, you have to convince the right that you care about the dangers of big government. And if you're on the right, you have to convince the left that you care about the dangers of big corporations. If you don't go there, then you're never going to get them on your side. And finally, we don't need 51% to win. The transpartisan movement, if we look to try to gather 51% of Americans to support our cause, we may not get there. The media system is biased against us. The economic system is biased against us. But all we need is to understand the system. And the system is if we control 10%, we win every election in the country, every major election in the country. So this movement is all about identifying and recruiting that 10%. That's the channel for our objective. There is no demon. The demon isn't the right. The demon isn't the left. It's not corporations. It's not government. The demon is our unwillingness to use our own power, to recognize that we have the power to make change, to empower ourselves to do so, not be dependent on big centralized interests, but to understand the power that we have and to use it. Thank you very much.